We're going to start up now with our section on the skeletal system and looking at what this chapter is going to look like. We're going to start by looking at functions of bone and the skeleton in general. We'll take a look at the structure of bone in terms of the different types of cells and so forth, as well as how those cells live and how the bone actually does serve as more of an organ than anything else. It's got not only bone cells, but there are nerves there, there's circulatory tissue there as well, there's connective tissue, so it's a very complex sort of organ as well. We're going to go into bone remodeling, so this can occur as a result of changes to the skeleton. It can be the result of exercise, for example, so we'll see how actually weightlifting can contribute to not only increased muscle mass, but increased bone mass as well. From there, we'll go into the axial skeleton, which is the skull and the vertebrae for the most part, and then into the appendicular skeleton, which is the appendages, appendages, arms, legs, shoulders, hips, those kinds of things, and then finally joints in this chapter as well. All right, so functions of the skeletal system and of bone in general. Number one, this is a framework that surrounds everything else. This is the support system for the rest of the soft tissues inside the body. I still remember when I was a kid, I was probably 5 years old. I remember asking my mom why we have to have bones. I don't know why I asked that or why I remember that, but I remember her telling me that if we didn't have bones, then we would just simply be like a puddle on the floor, which is pretty accurate, right? A bunch of soft tissue with no support really wouldn't function very well at all. This is a place for muscles to attach. As we'll see, it doesn't do you any good to have muscles unless you have something to attach them to and something to move once those muscles contract. There's obviously a protective function here as well, so we can look at protection of the internal organs, whether we're dealing with the cranium, which protects the brain, the vertebrae to protect the spinal cord, the ribs to protect some of the visceral organs. Very much a protective function as well. It's sort of like a bank when it comes to storage of minerals, calcium, phosphate, those kinds of things, as well as fat. We have the production of blood cells inside the red marrow of some of the bones. So both red blood cells and white blood cells can be produced by bones as well. We've got sensory transduction, which means primarily hearing. So one of the things that we'll see later on is the bones in the ear actually work by detecting vibrations and passing those vibrations or the stimulus onto other aspects of the nervous system. All right, so the endoskeleton is a skeleton that happens inside the body of an animal. Organisms that have an internal skeleton are said to have an endoskeleton. So there are two main groups that have these. There are echinoderms, which are things like your starfish and sea urchins and sea cucumbers and those sorts of things. Their endoskeleton is made out of calcite or calcium carbonate. So their skeleton is actually made out of basically little plates that overlap each other and give protection to the inside of the animal and muscle attachment and everything else. If we look at vertebrate bones, fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, then we're dealing primarily with calcium phosphate. So that's what we have as humans. We have calcium phosphate in our bones. All right, and so when we look at the contractions of muscles, we talk about antagonistic muscles, which means muscles that work against each other. So if you think about your biceps muscle and your triceps muscle, one of those is going to flex the lower arm up, the other one's going to extend the lower arm down. So the biceps in the front, the triceps in the back of the upper part of the arm are antagonistic, and by doing so, by alternating when they contract, they allow for the forearm to move up and down as you flex or extend that forearm. So we see antagonistic muscles here, like I mentioned, biceps, which cause the lower arm to flex upwards, and then triceps that when they're contracting are going to cause the arm to extend downwards. And so one thing we notice here is that whenever one set of muscles contracts, the other one has to relax. So if you think about trying to contract both your biceps and triceps, go ahead and sit there right now and try to flex both your biceps and triceps, and then try to make your lower arm move. It doesn't work. Right? You've got to relax one while you contract the other one if you're going to have any sort of motion happening as a result. As we'll see, our bones are not always bones in terms of calcium phosphate. Most vertebrates have a skeleton that starts off or is initiated as cartilage, which kind of harkens back to our ancestry of cartilage skeleton-bearing animals. In the vertebrate world, for the most part, all of our bones start off as cartilage, and over time, that cartilage primarily gets replaced by bone over time. Bone is advantageous in a couple of ways. It's very strong. It's also repairable. So for animals that have a completely cartilaginous skeleton, you got a lot of flexibility there, which is a good thing. It's fairly strong, but the problem with cartilage is that it doesn't repair. And if you've ever had a cartilage injury, I probably don't have to tell you that. But bone is a much more repairable and dynamic sort of a tissue than cartilage is. Like we saw back in our chapter on animal systems, Bone cells can divide fairly frequently, cartilage cells not so much. So one of the big benefits here of having a bony endoskeleton is this constant remodeling and changing in response to stress or even injury. If a bone breaks, it's repairable. If cartilage tears, for the most part, it's not. Okay. So in the human body, we have roughly around, give or take, 206 different bones. Most of these have both compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone being on the outer layer, spongy bone being more toward the core of the bone. Different bones have different amounts and proportions of these two types of bone depending on what those bones are, what they do, their size, proportions, and so forth. Compact bone is much denser, it's much stronger. Spongy bone, like the name might imply, has sort of like little air spaces in there or something akin to air spaces to make it spongy. That's also a very important bone as well when it comes to producing some of the other functions of the bone that we talked about early on in the course. So compact bone, like I mentioned, is very dense, very hard. It's typically at the outer layers of the bones, and it protects the spongy bone within. It's much more difficult to break compact bone than it is spongy bone if you look at kind of a similar amount of those two substances. Compact bone is much more durable. In a typical bone, compact bone is less part of the bone than the spongy bone is. There's less of this proportionally than there is the spongy bone inside of it. We talk about osteon, so this entire space around this entire unit here, I should say, is an osteon. Inside of this, there are blood vessels, there are nerves, there are spaces occupied by the cells themselves. Little spaces are where the bone cells actually live. And so they actually have a fairly good degree of connectedness between them. Once you move toward the core of the bone, then you start running into more of that spongy bone, which has a lot more lightweight, has a lot more in the way of blood vessels, it's porous, and this is also where you tend to find the bone marrow. So this is where you might see some of those functions like producing blood cells taking place would be in the spongy bone. So again, another pretty good look at a cross-section of a bone here. We have medullary bone. This is the core part, the medulla here, which has the spongy bone as well as the marrow as well. Outside of that, we then start moving into layers of compact bone, which is much denser and a lot stronger, pound per pound, much stronger. But if you look at this picture over here, what you'll notice is that the compact bone is a fairly thin layer, and the spongy bone makes up more of the interior of the bone itself. All this inside of here is the medullary bone and the spongy bone inside of that. If we look up toward the top of this bone, this might be like a femur, right? So your thigh bone, the part that connects to your hip up at the top versus the part that connects to your knee down here at the bottom. A lot of spongy bone inside of this, more compact bone toward the outside of it to give it strength and protection. But overall, the main interior part of the bone is either going to be marrow or spongy bone for the most part. The epiphysis up here at the top is kind of the rounded part, the bigger part of the top and bottom. Those are both called the epiphysis. And that will be important when we start talking about bone growth. We talk about epiphyseal growth occurring at the ends of the bone down here, like we see this growth plate. This is going to come into play here in a few minutes when we start talking about growth occurring at the ends of the bones. All right, so we talked about the compact bone. We also talked about the osteon units that contain the blood vessels and nerves and so forth. There's also a layer on the outside of the compact bone called the periosteal layer. The periosteum means on the outside or surrounding the bone. And so the periosteum, for the most part, is going to be made up of collagen fibers, another type of connective tissue. Collagen fibers are proteins, and they're also flexible. So this is going to give the bones a degree of flexibility so they can bend actually without breaking. The bone itself, without the periosteal layer, would be extremely fragile, and simply, taking a couple steps down the street probably would be enough to break your femur if you didn't have the periosteal layer, this protein layer on the outside of it. It surrounds it kind of like a net and gives it some degree of flexibility and reinforcement, so it doesn't get to the point where it's exerting so much force on it that it actually breaks. So that's a very nice feature to have as well. All right, so we can take a look at bone structure next. We saw compact bone previously. We'll look now at spongy bone. So the internal sides or internal side of the bone itself, a lot less dense, right? A lot less material on the inside of here, a lot more in the way of little cavities and what look like little pockets or air spaces, but also a lot in the way of reinforcement. All these kind of cross struts here give the spongy bone on the interior a fair amount of strength. It's fairly well reinforced on the inside there as well. Spongy bone primarily is at the ends and the epiphyses beneath the compact bone. It's also in the flat bones in the cranium and the skull. That's made primarily of spongy bone as well. In the adult form, at least in mammals, some of these spaces are filled with red marrow, and some of the other spaces are filled with yellow marrow. So again, we have this idea of bones being used to produce blood cells and being able to store fat kind of at the same time using either red or yellow marrow. In terms of connective tissues, we've seen ligaments before. We saw this back in our chapter on animal tissues and homeostasis. Ligaments are types of connective tissue, very, very dense, regular connective tissue that connect bone to bone. And again, this connective tissue is made primarily of collagen fibers as well as the cells themselves that connect the bones to the other bones and allow them to move along with each other. Cartilage is also a type of connective tissue. We tend to find this as sort of a supportive feature. We see this kind of cool picture over here. This is a very young embryo. What we notice in this picture is most of this embryo, its bones are pretty much all there. I mean, most of the main bones are there, but if you were to actually analyze these, the predominant part of these bones would still be cartilage in that picture. They have not yet become bony per se. They're still cartilage based, going through that kind of remodeling process, turning into bone after starting off as cartilaginous model. The big function of cartilage in the skeletal system, at least, is to provide some smooth movement of bone past bone, especially in the joints, right? You want to have that cartilage kind of at the tips of the bones so that when you bend your knee or your hips or your elbows or your shoulders, you don't have bone moving across bone directly. You've got this nice thin layer of cartilage to kind of like lubricate the bones and provide a smoother movement of bone past bone so it's not quite as uncomfortable. The other type of connective tissue, of course, is bone itself. Don't forget that too is a connective tissue, so that one's also very important. All right, so looking at cartilage now. We've kind of seen this before. We're going to review a little bit. Cartilage cells are also called chondrocytes. They are going to secrete, again, a matrix on the outside like any other connective tissue. These are cells surrounded by a collagen-based matrix in addition to some other protein fibers. Chondroitin, for example, is a very common cartilage protein that we find. Cartilage tissue, as a tissue, doesn't have a whole lot in the way of blood supply, so if there's a cartilage injury, these cells are not repairing. You see in this picture down here, these little cells don't divide very quickly. So if there's damage here, they're not going to be replacing themselves very quickly, if at all. Whereas over here with the osteocytes, in these little spaces here, they actually can divide and maintain themselves and repair if a damage were to occur. So again, the entire unit here is the osteon. This entire kind of ring, almost like a tree trunk where you've got rings in it, is an osteon. In the center of this are blood vessels and nerves. And then within each one of these little spaces here, there are osteocytes or bone cells living in there, and again, capable of dividing as need might present itself. All right. So again, we have this idea of cartilage-based skeletons giving rise to what amounts to eventually a bony skeleton. There is a process of calcification where calcium phosphate comes in and gradually replaces cartilage over time. And again, that's a fairly big advantage because bone is a much more workable material. It's much more dynamic. Cells can divide, and you get this idea of repair and rebuilding that takes place over time. So again, we've seen osteons before. The little spaces where the bone cells live, these little cavities inside of here, if I get my cursor to work, these are called lacuna. These little spaces are lacuna, and inside of those lacuna are where the osteocytes actually live. So there's a lot of connection here. There's a lot of nutrient transfer. There's a lot of waste transfer as well. There's a lot of connectedness between bone cells and each other. The matrix in the case of bone as a connective tissue is calcium phosphate. The calcium phosphate is the matrix. It's the non-living part of the connective tissue, but of course it's the bulk of the bone itself is the calcium phosphate. Even though it's kind of permeated by these bone cells throughout, most of the bone itself is actually calcium phosphate, which is a non-living tissue. Bone is not especially flexible. Calcium phosphate by itself is actually very brittle, very easily broken, very fragile. That's where that periosteum comes into play and allows for some flexibility of bone because the bone itself, the calcium phosphate, is so inflexible. So again, we've seen this picture before. Osteons are these functional units with blood vessels and nerves. Lacuna are the little spaces inside of which the osteocytes live. And again, there's a lot of blood flow taking place here. There's a lot of nerves traveling throughout this. So obviously if a bone is broken, it hurts. There are nerves there to detect damage as well as stretch and so forth as well, like any other part of the peripheral nervous system. As far as bone cells, there are three main types of bone cells. There are osteoblasts, which are the bone-forming cells. They are like the pre-bone cells. These are the ones that begin to secrete the collagen and the calcium phosphate into the bone itself. Osteocytes are the mature bone cells. They're the ones that are fed by capillaries. They get nutrients from capillaries. They give up waste to capillaries. They're the ones that are there after a bone has been formed and when a bone is actually carrying on and being functional and those kinds of things. And again, we have these connections here to other osteocytes. So where in the case of cartilage cells, chondrocytes, they're not very connected. In the case of bone cells, there's a high degree of connectedness from one bone cell to the next. Osteoclasts, on the other hand, are cells that break down bone. You might say, well, geez, that sounds like a not very good idea. Why would I ever want to break down bones? Well, it turns out there are times when that actually is important. It could happen during a bone break, where you want to have, during the repair process, you may want to have some of the bone sort of broken down and remodeled. It might happen during a period of time when maybe blood calcium levels fall too far. You need to release some calcium back into the blood to support yourself, keep yourself alive. Osteoclasts can come along and kind of partially break down bone, release calcium into the blood, and kind of provide a stopgap measure to prevent deficiencies or problems or deficiencies that might result as a lack of blood calcium might persist over time. We see earlier again in this picture here, these cartilage cells in this skeleton here are certainly alive, but not very good at dividing. So over time what occurs is that because these cartilage cells don't divide, because they're not especially well fed by capillaries and so forth, they're going to be replaced by bone, which is of course a much more dynamic tissue. That's kind of the theme we're seeing throughout this chapter, is bone is much more dynamic and flexible functionally, not like literally, but functionally flexible than cartilage is. So what occurs over time is we see in these cartilage models here, and again, we see a little humerus and a radius and an ulna and a femur and a tibia and a fibula and all these kinds of things. All the main bones, the ribs, the vertebrae, everything is there, right? The cranial plates are all there. They all start off as cartilage, and then very early on, those osteoblasts start to secrete this calcium phosphate around the cartilage-based model. So what you end up with is a bony shell around a cartilaginous-based core, right? And that's kind of how this formation of bone starts. What begins to happen then is these bone cells migrate inwards toward the bone cavity to form the spongy bone. All right, the main part of cartilage that's left behind is in the growth plate. So if we look at a long bone, if we jump back here to a picture, that one's okay. Up here we've got that growth plate. This growth plate, when you're a kid, up until your late teens, maybe early 20s, this is the only bit of cartilage you have left in your long bones. This thing, when you were an embryo, would have been entirely cartilaginous, at least for a while. But it gets replaced by bone, except for growth plates that occur here and also down here at the other end. Right? Those growth plates are cartilage-based, and when you are growing, when you're a kid, when you're growing up until your late teens, early 20s, is that these cartilage cells actually do divide somewhat slowly, but they do divide, so your bones get longer. Right? You remember that picture a couple of slides ago? We had the epiphysis at the top, epiphysis at the bottom. There would be growth happening in both the upwards and downwards direction, at least as far as that picture was oriented. Now, what eventually happens is that behind that growth plate, there is further division of bone cells. So what you can imagine is like a race in cell division between cartilage and bone. Cartilage is going along in one direction, bone is following along right behind it, but the thing is, bone divides faster than cartilage. So eventually the bone cell division catches up with the cartilage cell division, and once that occurs, that growth plate that we saw a few minutes ago is going to be entirely replaced. It's going to be replaced by bone, and once that cartilage growth plate is replaced by bone, that bone is not getting any longer. That bone is as long as it's ever going to be because the cartilage growth plate is basically gone at that point in time. And that's, again, what happens as you approach the period of time in your life when you're going to stop getting taller, is your cartilage growth plate has been used up in a sense, replaced by bone, and at that point, that's kind of the end of the line for growth of that particular bone. So growth in length actually stops at some point in time, but growth in diameter doesn't necessarily. As your bones get longer, they also get heavier because they need to be able to support themselves and have structural integrity and so forth. But even after growth in length stops, growth in diameter can still continue. So as we'll see, if you are someone that's very active, if you're a runner, if you're a weightlifter, if you play sports, your bones will tend to be a lot thicker than people who are less active, because there is a kind of this back and forth placing force and stress on the bones, and then bones responding by getting thicker that takes place as you are more and more active. And so your bones actually are stronger as you are more physically active as well, which is kind of a cool thing. People think about muscles getting bigger. It's actually the bone gets stronger too because of the physical forces you're placing on that bone. All right, so we see again our growth plate here. Very, very early on, fetal development, 2 months after conception. So we're looking at 8 weeks past fertilization here. At 2 months, it's almost all cartilage. By 3 months, it's mostly cartilage, but we have some bone forming on the outside over here. By 9 months, by approximately the time when gestation is over, we have the spongy bone forming up here and spongy bone down here. We still have that bone on the outside as well, what will eventually become compact bone. And then after birth, we start to see a really big increase in calcification of the bone. So most of the interior inside of here is now bone. Most of the cartilage has been replaced. And so as we move into childhood now, almost all the inside of the bone is actually calcified. And there's very, very little cartilage left. There's cartilage up here at the tips. That's going to help make the bone move more smoothly past the other bone that it's joined to or adjacent to. And then we also have our growth plates, like I talked about on the last slide. Our growth plates here and down here would be what allow this bones to get longer in the upwards and downwards direction, at least in terms of how that picture is set up. So that's kind of the overall growth. We call that growth plate the epiphyseal plate because it's up here on the epiphysis of the bone. This growth plate is the epiphyseal growth plate, and it's at the top and the bottom part of the bone, but only in the epiphysis. As far as growth hormones, we see this a lot in childhood, kind of the proximal trigger to drive division of and growth of those epiphyseal growth plates comes from growth hormones during childhood. We have thyroid hormones at play here as well. We have both calcitonin from the thyroid as well as parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands that are going to help provide the right level of calcium in the blood all the time to make sure the skeleton grows in the right proportions. Very important to have the right balance of thyroid hormones there at play as well to make sure these bones grow properly. And then, of course, once you move into puberty, the sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and so forth, these are the ones that kind of kick in around puberty. They allow those growth spurts to begin, and eventually, once those growth plates have been used up, the end of growth occurs as well. So when you think about a growth spurt, what that is a very rapid division of the epiphyseal plate during very specific, relatively short periods of time during one's life. And eventually, like I said before, once you get into the late teens, early 20s, for most people, that growth is pretty much going to stop at that point in time. All right, so we talked about the sex hormones. By the time we get into our late teens, that growth plate has become very, very thin. There's almost no cartilage left. By the time you move into your 20s, the only cartilage left at the bones is going to be at the ends of the bones to allow that fluid movement of one bone past another one. As long as that is maintained, that's a good thing. As you sort of age and the more active you are as well, this is the downside of being active, the more that cartilage is kind of worn away and the less of it there is to help provide that cushioning and smooth movement of bone past other bones. But that's really the only cartilage you have left in terms of how the bones are structured once you get past your early 20s. The growth plate thins up. We see the calcification joined together. The calcification on either side of the epiphyseal plate is then joined together. And at that point, growth and length is done. But again, growth in girth or diameter can still continue past the early 20s and throughout the entire life, really. It's not a one-time only kind of a thing. So we'll stop this section here, and I'll pick up with the next section here in just a second.